for his daughter. But when his shovel hit an old suitcase buried deep underground, everything in his life changed forever. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments which country you're watching from. The sun had only just begun its slow rise over the quiet suburban street when Oscar Bennett stepped out onto the small wooden porch of his house, rubbing his eyes with the back of his hand. The air was cool and still. The sky was a pale shade of blue, touched by a faint blush of gold. It was the kind of morning that carried the illusion of peace, the kind that made a man think that no matter how hard life had pressed against him yesterday, today might be a little kinder. He wanted to believe that. He needed to. Oscar worked long hours, longer than he liked to admit, loading trucks at a distribution warehouse across town. It was a job that demanded strength more than skill, and after years of hefting boxes onto pallets and rolling carts across concrete floors, his back often throbbed even before he got out of bed. But it paid just enough to keep the lights on and food on the table, and that was what mattered, especially now when he was the only parent his daughter had left. Inside the house, a soft hum of life stirred. A little girl's laugh, or perhaps a sleepy mumble, filtered through the cracked window above the kitchen sink. It brought a small, tender smile to Oscar's lips. Amara. His pride and his weakness. 8 years old, with the kind of smile that could lift the heaviest sadness and the kind of imagination that made the world seem far more magical than reality ever could be. He turned back inside and found her in the living room, sitting cross-legged on the worn rug with her favorite teddy bear tucked under one arm. Her hair, still messy from sleep, fell in soft curls over her forehead. She looked up at him with bright curiosity, her big eyes promising new adventures in the day ahead. "Daddy," she said, though Oscar always heard the word as a prayer, "are we still building my castle today?" Her castle. What she really meant was the simple play area he had promised, somewhere she could swing, climb, laugh, and pretend that the world was full of wonders. He had chosen the backyard, a modest patch of land behind the house that had once held rows of tomato plants and cucumbers before life changed and there wasn't time for gardening anymore. The soil had grown wild and uneven, and the fence needed repair, but Amara saw none of that. She saw potential. She saw joy waiting to happen. Oscar knelt to her level and brushed a curl from her forehead. "We sure are. Got a lot of dirt to move, though. Might need my little helper later." She grinned, proud to be needed for something so important. Breakfast was simple, scrambled eggs on slightly burnt toast, but to Amara it was a feast. Oscar watched her eat, grateful that she still found delight in little things. He remembered the nights when dinners were thinner and her plate wasn't as full. He promised himself again that she would never go hungry, not while he drew breath. After washing the dishes, he sent her to watch cartoons while he gathered his tools. The old, rust-flecked shovel leaned against the wall in the garage, beside a dented metal wheelbarrow with a squeaky wheel. He checked the ground once more where he planned to build, a spot beneath the lone tree, sheltered by its branches in the summer heat. He pictured a slide there, maybe a sandbox, and a small wooden bench he would carve himself. He could already imagine Amara's laughter bouncing off the backyard fence. Oscar drove the shovel into the ground. The soil was harder than he expected, packed by years of neglect and stubborn roots that resisted every push. Sweat gathered at the nape of his neck as he worked. He paused occasionally to stretch his back, glancing through the kitchen window where he could see Amara dancing to songs on the television. Every time he looked at her, the ache felt more bearable. Minutes bled into hours. The sun climbed higher, warming the earth and his skin. Dirt collected beneath his nails and streaked across his forearms, but he welcomed the exhaustion. This was a father's labor, a promise being carved into the future, one shovelful of soil at a time. He found comfort in that. Then the shovel struck something solid. The sound was subtle, more of a muted thud than the metallic ring of hitting a rock. He paused, frowning. At first, he thought it must be a chunk of concrete or a buried piece of scrap left by the previous homeowner. He knelt and dug with his hands, tearing away clumps of dark soil. Something flat emerged. Rusted metal, the edge of an object too straight to be part of nature. Curiosity flared. He widened the hole, revealing the corner of a rectangular shape about a foot below the surface. The soil around it was packed tighter still, as though time itself had conspired to keep it hidden. The more he uncovered, the heavier his breath became. It was a suitcase, or what was left of one. The fabric had long rotted away, leaving behind a battered, corroded metal case bound by strips of decaying tape. Oscar's heartbeat thickened in his throat. The rational part of him whispered that this was nothing, something discarded years ago, nothing worth worrying about. But another part, deeper and far less calm, warned him that he should leave it buried. He ignored that voice. He hooked the shovel beneath the case and heaved, muscles straining. The suitcase broke free of the earth with a sickening crack of roots giving way. He stood over it, chest heaving, feeling oddly winded, not just from effort, but from a creeping unease he couldn't explain. It looked old, decades old. Rust had bitten through the hinges and clumps of earth clung to its sides like dried blood. The tape, wrapped around it multiple times, suggested someone had wanted it shut. Truly shut. No casual traveler sealed a suitcase like that. A cold wind slipped through the yard, and Oscar shivered despite the heat. "Daddy?" Amara's voice drifted from the house. He quickly regained his composure and dragged the suitcase into the garage where she wouldn't see. He brushed dirt from his hands and went inside to assure her everything was fine, that he hadn't hurt himself. Only when she was back to her cartoons did he return to the suitcase, shutting the garage door behind him. For a long moment, he just stared. His fingers hovered over the tape before he forced himself to peel it back. It resisted. It must have been industrial tape, layered on thick like a warning. When it finally tore, it came apart in ragged strips. The latches groaned when he forced them open. The lid creaked upward. Inside were stacks of money. Neat bundles of bills, bound by faded bank straps, each brick thick enough to make his hands tremble. Tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars, untouched by time except for the yellowing edges. The sight hit him like a punch to the chest. Money like this could wipe away his debts, guarantee a future for Amara, bring security he'd never known. But nestled beside the money was a gun. Not a hunting pistol or something left behind by a hobbyist, but a revolver with the serial number filed down, the metal darkened and scarred with age. It screamed violence, crime. And beneath the revolver lay a photograph. He picked it up with trembling fingers. A middle-aged man stared back at him with lifeless eyes, his shirt stained by a dark bloom of dried blood spread across his chest. There was no mistaking that he was dead, and that whatever had been done to him had been brutal, personal. Oscar swallowed hard, nausea creeping up his throat. He felt the air around him shrink, the garage suddenly too small and suffocating. He placed the photograph aside, but his gaze fell on a sealed envelope wedged between the stacks of cash. The paper was brittle, the ink smudged and faded, but he could still make out a desperate scrawl addressed not to a bank or a business, but to a human soul. "If you find this, please Save my family. He tore the envelope open, his hands unsteady. The note inside was short, a plea. Whoever had written it had done so in haste, their words stumbled and uneven. They will hurt her. They will kill my wife. Anyone who knows. Please, if you read this, take her away. Don't let them find her. A name followed, then an address. Oscar's breath caught in his chest. Every instinct screamed that this was trouble, real trouble, the kind that swallowed ordinary people whole and spat out their bones. He reached for the suitcase lid and slammed it shut, as though closing the case could make the terror inside disappear. He backed away, heartbeat pounding like a drum, fear crawling beneath his skin. He pressed a hand to his forehead, trying to steady his thoughts. Money, a gun, a murdered man, a plea for help. This wasn't some lost treasure. It was a grave someone had buried beneath his home. His first thought was to call the police, report everything, wash his hands of this nightmare. But then Amara's laughter floated through the house again, sweet and unknowing. His heart clenched. What if the police didn't believe him? What if they suspected him? What if the wrong person caught wind of his discovery? He shut his eyes, a tremor running through him. He was a father. His first duty was to protect his daughter, to keep her safe from every threat, every shadow. But whose family was he condemning if he pretended this never happened? The weight of the suitcase pressed into his mind like a dark prophecy. His world, so hard-won and fragile, balanced on the edge of that discovery. He looked towards the house, where the warm light glowed through the windows and Amara's silhouette moved cheerfully behind the curtains. He wanted to believe that everything could remain normal, that he could bury the suitcase again and pretend none of this had occurred. But there are moments in life that split time into before and after, and Oscar Bennett had just crossed into the after. Night crept into the neighborhood quietly, but Oscar's home did not share its calm. The house was dim, the lights turned low, as though he hoped invisibility would protect them. The suitcase remained in the garage, sealed once again, but it felt as though its presence radiated through the walls, humming with the weight of a secret too big to contain. Oscar could not shake the disturbing images that kept flashing through his mind. Blood spreading across someone's chest, the cold metal of the gun, the plea scratched onto yellowing paper. He sat at the edge of his bed, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. Sleep was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the dead man in the photograph staring back at him, accusingly or pleadingly, he couldn't determine which. Amara slept peacefully in the next room, curled against her stuffed bear under a blanket decorated with cartoon stars. The innocence of her slumber only deepened the dread in Oscar's heart. He did not know what terrified him more, the danger that might already be reaching for them or the possibility that he, through a single misguided decision, could bring that danger closer. The suitcase held freedom and doom side by side. All the money needed to change their lives forever, and yet a gun and a murder to ensure that whoever had buried it would not hesitate to take a life to get it back. His thoughts tangled in endless loops. Call the police and risk being treated as a suspect, hide the suitcase and live in fear of whoever was searching for it, or run, though run where and how far. Hours passed. The only sound in the house came from the quiet ticking of the old clock in the hallway. When the clock struck midnight, Oscar stood and looked out the window. He half expected to see police sirens or men in dark coats watching from across the street, but the road was empty. The silence outside seemed unnatural, too still. He tried to lie beside Amara for comfort, watching her chest rise and fall gently, but the bed might as well have been a slab of stone. His mind refused to rest. Thoughts pressed like a vice around his skull. What if someone knew the suitcase had been unearthed? What if they had been watching the backyard? What if they were already planning their move? The hours dragged until at last the sky began to lighten. Morning crept in sluggishly, painting the windows with a pale shade of gray. Oscar rose before Amara woke, and even the mundane routines of breakfast felt wrong, as though pretending at normalcy was, in itself, a dangerous act. He tried to move with purpose, but his hands kept shaking. He nearly dropped the carton of juice when pouring her a cup. Amara didn't seem to notice. She chattered happily about school and the castle they would build, completely unaware of the terror that clung to her father like a shadow he couldn't shake off. After dropping her off at a kind neighbor's house for the day, given some excuse about needing to run errands, Oscar returned home with the intention of calling the police. He stood with his phone in his hand, thumb hovering over the numbers. He imagined the officers entering his home, finding the money, the weapon, the body, and the photograph. He imagined their questions, their suspicions. He imagined Amara being asked to stay somewhere else for her safety, or worse, while they sorted out whether her father was a criminal. He placed the phone down. His thoughts spiraled until his anxiety tightened into a fist of determination. The note in the suitcase had not been a request to turn the evidence over. It had asked for help, to save someone, a wife, a family, someone just as scared now as he was. But fear was winning. He recognized that uncomfortable truth as soon as he looked at the clock again. Hours wasted. He felt like a man drowning in indecision when suddenly the sound of tires crunching gravel outside sliced through the stillness. The front of Oscar's house faced a street rarely visited by anyone who wasn't a resident. Cars didn't simply stop outside unless they belonged there. He moved to the living room window cautiously and peeked through the corner of the curtain. A black SUV had parked at the curb, dark-tinted windows creating a look that matched the dread swirling in his chest. The vehicle was too new, too large, too foreign to belong in a neighborhood of old sedans and aging pickup trucks. Two men stepped out. Their suits were pressed, their shoes polished. They walked with synchronized purpose toward his house, as though this place, this moment, belonged to them. Oscar's breath caught in his throat. Instinctively, he backed away from the window, heart hammering wildly. Someone knocked. 3 sharp, commanding raps on the front door that reverberated through the hallway. Oscar didn't answer. He pressed himself against the wall, willing himself into silence. For a brief moment, the knocking stopped. But then he heard the faint creak of footsteps moving along the porch, the weight of attention shifting as though the men were studying the house itself. One voice, a calm, almost polite tone, spoke near the door, muffled but unmistakably confident. It wasn't a threat, it was worse. It sounded like a promise. They knew what had been found, and they expected cooperation. Oscar froze. His instinct screamed at him to protect Amara, to protect their entire world. Minutes stretched like hours. The men eventually returned to the SUV, but before driving away they paused at the edge of his yard, staring towards the backyard where the soil had been freshly disturbed. Even from a distance, their body language told a clear message they knew. The vehicle pulled away with slow deliberation as if they wanted to ensure he had time to watch them go. This wasn't a visit. It was a warning. Oscar shut all the blinds. His hands trembled uncontrollably as he locked every door and checked each window latch twice. His breathing came fast and shallow, fear crackling beneath his skin like electricity. They knew what he had dug up. They probably knew that the suitcase still lay somewhere on the property. They likely knew he had a daughter. That last thought made his stomach twist violently. He didn't dare return to the garage. Instead, he sat in the living room, unable to do anything but unravel. Every second felt like a countdown to something catastrophic. Anxiety manifested as a suffocating loop. If he returned the suitcase, they might spare him. But what about the address in the note? The plea, the family in danger. If he kept it, he risked becoming a target. If he called the police, he risked implicating himself. He had never felt so trapped. Time crawled until finally the afternoon came, and he headed to pick up Amara. Seeing her rush toward him, arms open, full of trust and joy, made the terror more unbearable. He hugged her longer than usual, too afraid to let go. She didn't know how the world had shifted beneath their feet. She didn't see the shadows encircling them, and he didn't want her to. Dinner tasted like ash in his mouth. He tried to smile, tried to laugh when she told him a silly story about a rainbow-colored dinosaur her friend drew at daycare. But every noise outside made him jump. Every passing car sent his pulse racing. When he put her to bed that night, he tucked the blanket tighter around her, as though he could wrap her in a promise of safety. He kissed her forehead, longer than necessary, remaining beside the bed until she drifted to sleep. He stared at her tiny hand resting atop her teddy bear and vowed silently that he would never let anything happen to her. But the vow knotted painfully with the memory of the letter. Another father, one he'd never met, had written a plea born from the same desperation Oscar felt now. That man had died trying to protect his family. Was Oscar ready to do any less? He stepped quietly back into the hallway. His fear had not faded, but something inside him had begun to transform. There was a new certainty pushing its way above the panic. He might be terrified, but he would fight. He would find the woman mentioned in the letter. He would understand what he had stumbled into before choosing a path, because ignorance was just another kind of death. And yet, despite that resolve, sleep evaded him once more. He lay in bed with his eyes wide open until exhaustion dimmed his thoughts. He drifted in and out of uneasy dreams. The shadow of the SUV burned into the back of his mind, the knock echoing like a memory that refused to be forgotten. Before dawn broke, he woke with a start, his pulse still racing. The house was quiet, but the feeling of being watched persisted, as if the black vehicle had never truly left. Oscar sat up slowly, rubbed his face, and took a deep breath. Sitting in fear would not save them. Waiting would only make things worse. He needed answers. He needed to find the widow whose life might still depend on that buried plea for help. As the first haze of morning spilled into the sky, Oscar looked once more toward the garage. The suitcase seemed to call to him, not with temptation this time, but with urgency. He knew what he needed to do, even if the way forward was clouded in danger. He would follow the letter. He would seek out the truth. But he did not yet realize that the truth was already seeking him too. By the time the morning light fully crested the horizon, Oscar had already made his decision. Running from the truth would not save him, and it certainly would not save the people whose lives had already been destroyed by whoever buried that suitcase. If those same people now believed he had stumbled into their secrets, the danger was already upon him. Ignoring the plea in that letter would not change that. It would only make him complicit in another family's suffering. The note had been written by a man who died desperate to protect someone he loved. Oscar could not ignore that parallel, not when he spent every waking moment trying to protect his own daughter. He sent Amara with their neighbor again, offering the same vague explanation that he needed to run errands. He tried to keep his tone light, to hide the tension in his body, but the neighbor noticed anyway. She studied him closely, her eyes narrowing with a question she didn't ask. Before she could voice concern, he thanked her hastily and walked away. He couldn't linger. Every second felt like borrowed time. The address from the letter had burned itself into his mind. He typed it into his phone's GPS, hands trembling slightly as the road appeared on the screen. It led to a part of town he rarely visited, far beyond the warehouses and strip malls he knew. The drive took him through changing landscapes, from modest homes to streets lined with cracked sidewalks and shuttered storefronts, then, deeper still, into an industrial sprawl where factories loomed like rusting skeletons. The city grew less welcoming with each passing mile. As he drove, he kept checking his mirror. Every time he saw a dark vehicle behind him, his heart lurched. But none stayed long. The traffic here was too sparse, too transient. It was impossible to know if someone was following or if paranoia was simply gnawing at him. Finally, he reached a sprawling trailer park on the edge of an abandoned rail yard. The chain-link fences surrounding the area sagged under the weight of years. Wind rattled the loose gates. Trash skittered along the gravel, pushed by gusts like tumbleweeds of urban decay. The trailers themselves seemed to lean inward, as though time had pressed down on them until they buckled under the weight of neglect. The number from the letter led him to a trailer near the back. It was one of the oldest ones, its paint peeling in long strips, the metal frame rusted with pockmarks like old scars. The curtains inside were closed, blocking any hint of life. He stepped from the car, boots crunching on scattered glass and dirt. For a moment, he considered turning back. He could tell himself there was nothing here worth risking his daughter's safety, but that was a lie, and he knew it. He approached the door and knocked gently. The sound echoed hollowly. Silence answered. He waited, then knocked again, louder this time. After a pause that felt endless, the faint sound of shuffling feet came from inside. A lock clicked uncertainly, and the door opened just enough for one cautious eye to peer out. The woman who looked back at him seemed smaller than the doorway itself, as though life had spent years shrinking her into the shape of her fear. Her hair was streaked with gray, pulled into a loose bun that had mostly fallen apart. Her skin was marked by deep lines, not merely from age, but from years spent bracing against threats. She stared at Oscar with distrust and something like dread, as though she already knew the reason he'd come. He softened his voice to a gentle calm. He didn't mention the suitcase. Instead, he spoke of the letter. At first, she didn't react, but then he mentioned her husband by name, repeating the name written in a shaky scrawl on the envelope. The woman's eyes widened as though struck. Fear rippled across her expression, raw, exposed, impossible to hide. She hesitated, her gaze flicking to the street behind him, searching for watchers. Only when she saw none did she unlock the door fully and allow him inside. The trailer smelled faintly of stale air and poverty. Medication bottles cluttered a table beside a stack of unopened mail. Dishes, few in number, lay drying near the sink. The floor was bare except for a faded rug worn thin from years of pacing. She moved slowly, her joints stiff with either arthritis or tension, and motioned him to sit. Oscar explained how he found the case buried in his yard and mentioned the note. He left out the money and gun at first, testing her trust. As he spoke, her eyes welled with tears, not tears of relief, but tears that came from memories she had fought too long to bury. She sank into a shaky chair, clutching her hands together as though they were the only anchor keeping her from collapsing. She told him everything. Her husband had been a decent man once, a mechanic, good with his hands and proud of his work. They had 2 children, grown now and living far away, though still under the silent threat of the men who had stolen their father's life. Her husband had gotten tangled with the wrong people, forced to store money and weapons for a criminal ring after witnessing something he should never have seen. From that moment, they owned him. He had begged and pleaded for a way out, but the only exit they offered was a grave. The note he had written was his final act of resistance. He had buried the suitcase secretly, hoping someone somewhere would find it and save the family he could not protect. Her voice cracked as she spoke of the day he didn't come home. The men arrived instead, delivering a warning disguised as condolence. They never confirmed his death, but the message was clear. Do not ask questions. Do not speak to anyone. Do not run. If she disobeyed, her children would pay the price. She had lived like a prisoner ever since. Every knock at the door was terror. Every passing vehicle was a threat. Those men had not needed to watch her constantly. Fear was enough to keep her locked inside her own life. Oscar sat in silence for a long while after she finished. The horror of what he had uncovered settled into his bones. The evil that had killed her husband was not abstract. It was organized, purposeful, still alive and watching. The letter had not exaggerated the danger. He finally told her the full truth. He explained about the money, the gun, the photograph, the 2 men in suits who had already come to his house. Her face turned ashen. Her hands began to tremble, and Oscar could see the heartbeat pounding frantically in her throat. She whispered that they would come for him now, for both of them, and for anyone connected to the suitcase. Her husband had always said that the buried evidence was their only chance at justice, but also the spark that could ignite vengeance. A sudden engine rumbled outside. Both froze. A black car rolled slowly down the gravel lane between the trailers. It didn't stop, but the tinted windows lingered as it passed. Oscar felt the blood drain from his face. The woman closed her eyes tightly, willing herself invisible. The car turned the corner and disappeared, but the silence it left behind was even more sinister. Oscar stood and moved to the window, peering out through a sliver in the curtain. Everything in the street looked normal again, but the heavy feeling in his chest told him he needed to leave. They couldn't talk long. Someone might already be piecing together the path that led him here. He knelt beside the woman and spoke softly, urgency replacing hesitation. He couldn't leave her like this. Her life was already endangered. Now that her husband's hidden secret had resurfaced, she was more vulnerable than ever. He told her he would return. He would not abandon her to these men. She looked at him with disbelief. Why would a stranger risk everything for someone he didn't know? Oscar didn't answer with words. He simply thought of Amara. He thought of how he would want the world to respond if she were ever in danger like this. He would want someone to care, someone to act. The woman's fragile fingers clutched his wrist. There was silent pleading in her eyes, begging him to be real, not another false hope. He promised her he would come back, soon, and that when he did, she wouldn't be alone. He left the trailer with a heart heavier than when he arrived. The air outside felt tighter, more oppressive. Shadows clung to every corner of the trailer park. He kept his head down, sensing eyes watching, even if he couldn't see them. He moved quickly to his car, unlocked it, and got inside, locking the doors immediately. Only when the engine started did he take a breath. His knuckles whitened against the steering wheel. He needed to think, needed to plan, needed to keep his daughter safe while somehow protecting this woman he barely knew. But as he drove away, he felt a shift inside himself, something hardening, sharpening. He had stumbled into a nightmare, yes, but he was no longer stumbling blindly. The truth had a face now, a name. Fear had a map, and the enemy was no longer an invisible silhouette behind a tinted window, but a real, vivid threat destroying families without regret. As the trailer park shrank into the rearview mirror, Oscar made a silent vow. He would not let that woman's suffering continue. He would not hand over the buried evidence and let the murder of a husband be erased. He would not allow the people behind that suitcase to keep feeding on innocent lives. The sun was falling by the time he returned to his street. He parked near his house and paused to catch his breath. The sight of his home, small and worn but filled with love, nearly broke him. He had to protect this place. He had to protect Amara. He had to protect a woman who had already lost everything but still lived in fear that she could lose more. He stepped inside, greeted by the sound of Amara's laughter and the soft glow of the evening light through the curtains. She ran into his arms, unaware of the danger just outside the walls of their sanctuary. He clung to her tightly, pressing his face into her hair. She squirmed and laughed, asking why he squeezed her like she was made of gold. Because she was. That night, after she fell asleep, he stood at the window once more, his heart pounding with a dark mixture of dread and resolve. He now truly understood that running would not save them. Neither would silence. Anyone who had killed once would kill again. He had seen the fear in that widow's eyes, and it was a mirror to his own. The path ahead was terrifying and uncertain, but he could no longer pretend that fate had not chosen him for this fight. He might not have asked for it, but he was in it now, and the shadows lurking outside his home would soon learn that he would not be an easy man to crush. The night after Oscar left the trailer park felt different from any night before. The darkness no longer seemed like a simple absence of light. It felt alive, aware, watching. Every creak of the house sounded like a footstep. Every shadow on the wall seemed to stretch its fingers toward him. He paced from room to room long after Amara had fallen asleep, checking and rechecking the locks, convincing himself that vigilance could hold back the danger tightening around them. He moved silently, careful not to disturb the peace of his daughter's dreaming world. She should not feel this fear. She should not grow up believing the world was filled with monsters who wore expensive suits and spoke in politely veiled threats. That was a burden he would carry alone. Hours passed while he wrestled with his thoughts. The suitcase remained untouched in the garage. He could not bring himself to open it again. The memory of the dead man's hollow eyes and the cold gleam of the revolver haunted him. But he remembered the bundles of money, too, each stack a reminder of a life that could have been easier, a future freed from debt and sacrifice. It tempted him in the quiet moments, whispering temptations of escape. He shook the thought from his head. They did not need the money. They needed safety. He returned briefly to his bedroom and watched Amara sleep. The moon cast a soft glow across her small features, making her appear almost angelic in her innocence. He felt the sting of guilt. He was lying to her, hiding danger from her, but there was no other way. She trusted him with everything she had. He would not betray that trust. He would not let her become another casualty of the nightmare buried beneath their backyard. The following morning, Oscar pretended everything was normal. He packed Amara's lunch, braided her hair, walked her to the neighbor's house with a smile he forced with such effort he felt his cheeks burn. The neighbor watched him again, clearly sensing something was wrong. She asked if everything was okay, and he replied too quickly, too firmly, insisting he was just tired. She eyed him with hesitation but didn't push. He was grateful for her silence. When he returned home, he stood in the driveway and looked toward the garage. The suitcase was waiting inside. He approached the door slowly, feeling the familiar dread crawl up his spine. He opened it and stepped inside, letting his eyes adjust to the dim interior. The metal case sat exactly where he'd left it, covered slightly in dust disturbed from the digging. It was both a burden and a key. He crouched down and ran a hand over the top, remembering the note, the pleading words of a dying man who only wanted to save his family. He took a deep breath. Then he made his first true decision since the nightmare began. He would not give the suitcase back. He would not hand the evidence over to the men who murdered for it. He would not walk into the police station with a weapon of a crime and hope they believed a stranger over the story a powerful criminal network would fabricate. He would not sit still and wait for violence to come knocking again. He would act. He would take control, not just for himself and Amara, but for the widow still trapped in her living nightmare. He returned inside, sat at the kitchen table, and began planning. There was only one path forward: get the woman away from that trailer park. As long as she remained under the silent surveillance of the men who killed her husband, she would always be a hostage held by fear. If they could get her somewhere remote, someplace hidden, they might gain enough time to think, to find someone they could trust, perhaps someone outside the reach of local corruption. A name surfaced in his mind. A man he once knew from work, someone quieter than most, but trustworthy. They had spent weekends fishing and hunting years ago, before life became suffocating. This friend owned a small hunting cabin deep in the woods, the kind of place only locals knew how to find. If he could get the keys, it could be their temporary refuge. Oscar found the old number in his phone's contacts. When he called, the conversation was brief and halting. They hadn't spoken properly in years. He didn't mention the truth, just said he needed a place to stay for a few days while dealing with some personal issues. There was a long pause on the other end before his friend finally agreed, saying he would leave the keys hidden near the cabin's porch. Oscar thanked him in a tone heavy with gratitude and unspoken panic. He packed a small duffel bag with essentials: food, water, spare clothes, blankets. He tucked the revolver from the suitcase into one of the side pockets, his stomach twisting as he did. He had never held a weapon before, never even considered it. But these were no longer days defined by what he had or had not imagined himself capable of. He didn't want to fire it. He only wanted the chance to defend his daughter if the world demanded it. He then turned to the money. He separated a portion of the cash, just enough to appear believable if the men in suits returned and demanded their property. He wrapped the rest in plastic and sealed it in a toolbox, hiding it beneath heavy equipment in the garage. If anything happened to him, maybe there would be enough there to help Amara survive or escape. But the men would not accept excuses easily. They would count every dollar missing. They would see through any lie if he wasn't careful. His pulse quickened at the thought. He knew deception was dangerous, but silence was worse. He had to show them a gesture of compliance, something that made him appear like a man willing to cooperate but too frightened to do anything more. He placed the partial cash into a second old duffel bag and set it aside. Then he rehearsed the story he would tell. The case had been damaged while buried. Some bills had rotted away. He had found less than what was originally hidden. He would appear panicked, remorseful. He would seem like a man who had accidentally stumbled into danger and wanted only to avoid further trouble. He thought about the suits from the black SUV, sharp-eyed, predatory. They would not be fooled easily, but they might allow him another day if they didn't sense rebellion. As he finished packing, the unease in his heart only grew stronger. There was no safety in this plan, only a slightly delayed collision with danger. But that delay might give him enough time to rescue the widow. Her fear, etched into every line of her face, haunted him just as much as the photograph of her murdered husband. He could not leave her to die under the cover of anonymity and silence. When the knock on the door came that evening, Oscar nearly dropped the phone he was holding. He froze, staring at the entrance as though a specter stood waiting on the other side. The hour was too late for guests, too perfect for an ambush. He moved slowly, peeking through the peephole. The black SUV was back, idling calmly at the curb like a wolf waiting for permission to enter the yard. Two men stood at the door, the same ones who had come before. Their expressions were unreadable, as though carved from stone. Oscar forced his breath into something steady. He opened the door only a crack, just enough to speak. The men told him, without raising their voices, that it was time to return what did not belong to him. Their polite tone scratched like sandpaper across his nerves. He grabbed the duffel bag with the partial money and held it out to them like an offering to a deity hell-bent on destruction. He lowered his eyes, as though too intimidated to meet their stare. The act came too easily. Fear was real enough. They took the bag, and one man inspected the contents, while the other studied Oscar's face. His gaze lingered, analyzing every twitch of discomfort. It felt like standing in front of a predator pretending not to be hungry. When the inspection finished, the second man gave a slow nod, but his expression twisted slightly. Suspicion, thinly veiled. They told him they would verify the amount. They told him that if anything was missing, if he had meddled in what he didn't understand, there would be consequences. Severe consequences. For him. For his daughter. For anyone tied to him. Oscar swallowed hard. He nodded silently, projecting fear without revealing the storm of defiance brewing underneath. When they finally left, the tension drained from his muscles in a violent tremor that nearly buckled his knees. He collapsed against the wall and sucked in a ragged breath, clinging to the knowledge that he had bought a little time. Not much, but maybe enough. He knew what came next. He grabbed his keys, returned to the garage for the suitcase, and loaded it into the truck beneath a pile of blankets. He would bring it with him, not to hand over, but to ensure that everything he needed to make a case against these men remained within reach. When the sky had darkened to a starless black, Oscar drove silently back to the trailer park. The streets seemed deserted, but paranoia whispered that eyes were following him through the darkness. His headlights swept over rows of dilapidated homes until he reached hers. He parked a short distance away, engine running softly as he scanned for threats. The widow must have been watching for him. Before he stepped out, her door opened a fraction, revealing her silhouette. She had a small bag by her feet, already packed. Her eyes held a fragile hope, desperate and terrified all at once. She had spent so many years preparing for the possibility of escape, but never believing it would come. When Oscar motioned for her to wait, she stayed still, trusting him despite fate giving her few reasons to trust anyone anymore. He left the engine idling and moved with the caution of a hunted animal. He checked between the trailers, watching for the glint of headlights or the sweep of a silhouette. Only when he felt a sliver of confidence did he wave for her to hurry. She moved as quietly as age and fear allowed, clutching her belongings close. He helped her into the passenger seat, and she gave him a look so overwhelmed with gratitude that he had to glance away to keep his composure. He pulled onto the road, headlights dimmed. The trailer park disappeared behind them, swallowed by the night. The widow kept her gaze fixed straight ahead, as though afraid that if she looked back, the nightmare would reach out and drag her home. Oscar followed the back roads, turning again and again to ensure they weren't followed. It took nearly an hour of serpentine driving before they reached the forest. Trees loomed tall and dark, their branches forming jagged arches overhead like the ribs of some giant beast. The cabin appeared at last, a small wooden structure hidden among towering pines. It looked cold, forgotten, untouched by anyone for years. But that was exactly what they needed, emptiness that offered refuge. Oscar parked behind the cabin, shielding the vehicle from sight. The air was crisp as they stepped out. The forest felt eerie but protective, like its silence guarded them from all the noise of the city's corruption. Inside, dust motes swirled through the air as they pushed open the door. The cabin smelled of stale wood and memories left behind. Oscar lit the old oil lamp he found hanging near the door. Its flickering light cast long shadows that danced like ghosts along the walls, but for the first time in days, Oscar felt like he could breathe. The widow sank onto a cot near the fireplace, exhaustion collapsing her thin frame. She looked smaller now, vulnerable in a new way, freed from one place of terror only to be plunged into the uncertainty of another. Oscar stood by the door, listening, waiting for engines, for footsteps, for any sign that danger had followed. There was nothing but the sound of wind rustling through the leaves outside. Still, his fear did not fade. A temporary sanctuary was still temporary, and the men who wanted the truth buried would not stop until they reclaimed their sins. He sat by the window, gripping the revolver through the fabric of its hiding place. His mind raced with questions he didn't yet know how to answer. What was his next move? Where could he go for help? Who could he trust? The widow broke the silence first. She spoke quietly, her voice scraping like dry leaves. She told him more about her husband. The night he came home shaking, the whispered names of the men he worked for, the deals he overheard, the violent consequences he witnessed. There were details, pieces of information that meant little to her, but could mean everything to someone who knew the world of organized crime. Oscar listened intently. He realized that the photograph wasn't the only damning proof of wrongdoing. The widow herself was a living repository of truth, a target only as long as she stayed alive and silent. If she could speak to the right people, she could expose more than just one murder. But the right people needed to be far beyond the reach of the black SUV. Oscar stared out into the darkness, the weight of those revelations pressing down on him. He knew that bailouts, halfway measures, and fear-driven decisions wouldn't save them. They needed action. They needed allies. They needed a plan that didn't simply postpone death, but guaranteed survival. For now, though, the only thing keeping them alive was that the men hunting them didn't yet know where they had gone. Oscar prayed that would remain true, because if those men found the cabin, as they inevitably would, running would no longer be enough. He would have to fight. Oscar did not sleep that first night in the cabin. He sat upright in a creaking wooden chair near the window, his hands wrapped tightly around the cold grip of the revolver concealed beneath his shirt. Every minor sound from the forest, the hooting of an owl, the shifting of branches, the distant crack of a twig beneath some unseen animal's foot, acted as a summons to his frayed nerves. He stared out into the moonlit darkness, searching for any unnatural movement, any sign that the shadows from the city had followed them into the woods. Behind him, the widow slept restlessly on the narrow cot by the fireplace, flinching at every sharp noise as though she feared the door would crash open at any moment. When dawn finally filtered through the trees in soft gold shafts, Oscar felt no relief, only a new anxiety forming in the brightness. The daylight could reveal their hiding place just as easily as darkness had concealed it. He stepped outside for a moment to breathe in the morning air and let the world reassure him they were truly alone. The cabin sat on a gentle rise above a shallow clearing where ferns and fallen logs marked the forest floor. Towering pines and sturdy oak trees crowded around it like silent sentinels. A stream murmured somewhere nearby, just loud enough to be heard over the rustling leaves. If he didn't know better, he could almost mistake this place for a sanctuary, but fear still clung to him like a second skin. The widow emerged not long after, rubbing her stiff joints and pulling her sweater tight against the morning chill. She looked around with a mix of awe and disbelief. After years of confinement in that trailer, she had forgotten what space and quiet could feel like. For a moment, the lines of fear on her face softened, replaced with a flickering gratitude. She took in a breath of freedom as though it were something fragile she might shatter if she exhaled too quickly. Oscar told her that before they did anything else, they needed to secure the area. He walked the perimeter of the cabin, marking the boundaries in his mind. He found a few vantage points where someone could hide and observe the cabin without being seen. He made mental notes. If the men found them, he would need to act before they stepped into those positions. He checked the vehicle as well, brushing away the dust that had collected on the windows overnight. The truck was the only way out. If the engine failed or they became blocked in, their chances of escape would shrink to nothing. Inside, he found matches, canned food, and a few warm blankets, leftovers from his friends' occasional hunting trips. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them alive for a few days. He boiled water on the stove and divided a can of beans with the widow. They ate in silence at first, but hunger gave way to conversation. She spoke in low tones about her husband, about the man he used to be before fear corroded his spirit. She shared the way he used to dance with her in their small living room, spinning her around until she burst into laughter. The brightest hopes began dimming, she said, when he came home one night with knuckles split and bloodied and terror widening his eyes. He confessed then that he had been threatened by men far more powerful than he had ever imagined. The wrong step, a single breath in the wrong direction, and their children would suffer for it. Her voice trembled as the memories grew more vivid. She described a specific night, the last time she saw her husband alive. He arrived late, shaking with cold or fear or both, and held her tightly as though his arms alone could shield her from whatever horror loomed behind him. He told her he had done something he wasn't supposed to do, something that gave him hope but would put her in grave danger if discovered. The next morning, he never returned from work. The widow never saw him again, except through the eyes of a stranger's warning. He made mistakes. You will pay for them if you speak. That was when the silent prison began. Her tears flowed quietly, and Oscar listened with a storm building inside him. Rage, grief, resolve. If he gave in to fear now, he would abandon her just like those men had hoped. He could not be another coward who turned away. He told her that staying hidden would only delay the inevitable. They needed help from someone who had the power to take on the people behind this. Not just any authority. There was too much risk of someone loyal to the criminals tipping them off. They needed someone completely outside their reach. But finding that person would require them to return to town, at least temporarily. They still had to gather information to track down the names and evidence the widow had remembered. They must understand how deep this nightmare went before they made a move that could expose them entirely. She mentioned a name, the name of a man her husband had worked with, someone who had attended meetings with the criminals. A man now posing as a legitimate businessman, charitable, respected by local leaders. Her husband had warned her never to say his name aloud. People who spoke about him in the wrong company tended to disappear. Oscar wrote the name down in his notebook, his hand shaking slightly. It was a clue, a target, a starting point, and a signal flare to any enemy who noticed they were investigating. The cabin was a refuge, but also a trap. If the men found their truck or saw tire tracks leading into the woods, they could surround the area long before Oscar or the widow realized danger had arrived. And then Amara would be alone, waiting for a father who would never return. Oscar refused to let that happen. He realized he had to bring his daughter somewhere safe before continuing. The neighbor had been suspicious, and if those suits returned to his house and found no one home, even temporarily, they might assume he had fled. He would need to take Amara away before they did, find another excuse that would not raise suspicions. That meant driving back to the city, a risk that knotted his stomach and made him question his courage once again. He explained to the widow that he would be gone for a few hours, but she shook her head violently at the thought of being left alone. He promised that he would lock the doors and that she could keep the revolver nearby. She stared at the weapon as though remembering what death looked like, then reluctantly accepted it. When he was certain she was prepared, Oscar climbed into the truck and drove off, heart pounding as the cabin disappeared behind him. The drive back seemed even longer than the night before. His eyes kept darting from the road to the mirrors, searching for a glimpse of the black SUV. Traffic thickened as he approached his street, but everything looked deceptively ordinary. He hurried to the neighbor's house and found Amara playing in the yard. She ran into his arms, shouting about drawings she had made and a cookie she'd been given. He hugged her tight, trying not to let the fear show on his face. He told the neighbor he was taking Amara on a short trip to visit a friend in the countryside. The woman's brow furrowed again, and she asked if everything was truly all right. Oscar assured her that it was, and that he just needed to take a break from work and the stress of bills. She accepted the explanation, although clearly unconvinced. As he helped Amara into the truck, he felt a prickle at the back of his neck, the sensation of being watched. He turned slowly and saw a car parked farther down the street. Not a black SUV, but a gray sedan with tinted windows. It didn't move. It simply idled there, like a patient hunter waiting for prey to grow careless. Oscar forced himself to look away, pretending he had noticed nothing. He buckled Amara in and drove off as calmly as he could manage. His heartbeat hammered louder with each mile. He expected the sedan to fall into line behind him, but it did not. The absence of pursuit only sharpened his nerves. If they weren't following him, then they were watching his home. They were waiting for him to slip. They assumed he was still scared enough to obey. That assumption was his only advantage. The moment their tires left pavement for dirt, Amara noticed the change. She pointed out the trees, marveling at deer grazing near the roadside. He did his best to respond cheerfully, though his mind was fixed on calculating how much time they had left before the men realized he had lied. When they reached the cabin again, the widow rushed from the doorway like a child greeting a long-awaited rescue. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, seeing Amara, as though the presence of youth made their escape feel more real. She guided the girl inside, showing her the blankets she had set out and the stuffed animal she found in a box near the wall. For the first time in days, Amara did not sense that anything was wrong. Oscar stepped outside to breathe again and let the forest swallow his fears. But the peace did not last. He paced around the cabin again, checking the windows, reinforcing the door with a wooden beam he found leaning against the shed. He gathered stones to block the road's tire tracks and constructed a makeshift barrier of branches to mask their presence. As night approached, the widow and Amara sat near the fire, speaking softly while Oscar stood watch by the window. Every flicker of the lamplight seemed loud and exposed. When darkness fell completely, he switched the lamp off. The forest swallowed them in blackness, leaving only the faint silver of moonlight spilling through the cracks between boards. The hours stretched. A distant sound of an engine echoed somewhere in the forest, faint, almost imagined. Then the snap of a branch underfoot, far too heavy to be an animal. Shadows shifted among trees like silhouettes trying to become men. Oscar gripped the revolver tighter. His pulse thundered in his ears as he strained to hear more. The forest fell still, completely still. They were not alone. Oscar motioned silently for the widow to take Amara into the corner behind the bed. His voice trembled as he whispered, "Stay there. Don't move. Don't make a sound." The widow clutched the girl protectively, pressing a hand against her mouth to stifle any cry. Oscar took position by the window again. The leaves rustled softly, a whisper that crept closer, step by deliberate step. He raised the revolver, steadying his breathing. There was a flash of lights far down the road, headlights, a slow, methodical approach. Someone had found them. The truck, hidden behind the cabin, suddenly seemed flimsy, the walls paper-thin. Oscar knew then that running would no longer be enough. The forest had ceased to be a sanctuary and had transformed into a trap. The men who had buried secrets beneath his home were now hunting him with relentless patience. If they crossed the threshold tonight, Oscar would have no choice. He would have to choose between never seeing the sunrise again, or making damn sure his enemies didn't either. Oscar stayed motionless by the window, his breath held tight in his chest as the distant engine noise grew closer. It wasn't the roaring speed of a reckless chase. No, this was deliberate, unhurried, predatory. Whoever approached was confident enough to take their time, certain of the trap they had laid and the inevitability of the prey within it. The headlights wove between trees like the searching eyes of a beast. Oscar felt the weight of responsibility grounding him in place. He had brought the widow and his daughter here, into a darkness that could now swallow them whole. Fear pulsed hot and deep in his blood, but beneath that fear something else surged, a steadfast resolve that he would not let this cabin become their tomb. The widow clutched Amara tightly in the shadows behind the bed, murmuring gentle reassurances into her ear. The child's body trembled, though she made no sound. Her trust in her father was complete, and she needed to believe, that he would protect them. Oscar knew that belief could not be betrayed. He slowly stepped back from the window and moved to the door, placing his free hand against the rough wood as if weighing its strength. It would not withstand force for long. A single kick from the wrong man would splinter it inward like paper. They had no time. The engine cut off, plunging the forest back into silence. That silence was the worst sound of all. It meant the hunters were on foot now. Oscar pictured them emerging from the underbrush, weapons drawn, their expensive shoes coated in dew and pine needles. He could almost smell the cologne they wore to mask the rot in their souls. He slipped over to the widow and placed the revolver into her trembling hand. Her eyes widened with horror, and she tried to push it back toward him, but he shook his head. If they got in, she would need it. He spoke in a whisper, nearly lost beneath the pounding of his heart. Take care of her. If anything happens, you run. Take her, and you don't look back. She wanted to argue, but the gravity in Oscar's eyes silenced her. She pressed her lips together, nodded once, and brought Amara closer. Oscar moved again, lit by the dim silver threads of moonlight filtering through the window. He crossed the small cabin to the opposite wall and unlatched a narrow crawl space beneath the floorboards. It wasn't large, but maybe large enough for a desperate escape. He let the door hang slightly open, a last resort if everything else failed. Then he forced himself to breathe, letting the cool air try to steady the chaos inside him. A crunch of leaves just outside the window made him flinch. Shadows shifted. Tall, unmistakably human shadows. Oscar's pulse hammered so violently he worried the sound might give him away. His mind spun through every step that had led them here, finding the suitcase, the plea in the letter, the first knock on his door. He realized there was no turning back. He stepped toward the table and grabbed the notepad where he had written the name the widow remembered, the name of the man who had orchestrated all this cruelty from behind wealth and respectability. The proof wasn't only in the suitcase anymore. It lived in the widow's memories, in the photograph of her husband, in the corrupt power fearful men held. It lived in Oscar's resolve. He had stored duplicates of everything that mattered, the photo, the letter, the details. He locked the originals in the metal case, then placed the case near the door. He knew what he was doing, drawing the enemy's attention. If they thought this was all he had, maybe they would not realize how much he had already sent into the world beyond their reach. His phone lay on the table beside him. Earlier that morning, after gathering what little he could from the widow's stories, he had searched and found contact information for a journalist known for exposing connections between crime and politics. It wasn't a guarantee, not even close, but it was hope. Before leaving the city, he had slipped copies of the damning evidence into an envelope and dropped it in a postal drop box far from his home. It was now beyond anyone's immediate reach, even his own. He had also scheduled a delayed email containing everything he knew, ready to send automatically if he didn't return within 2 days. Even if these men killed him, the truth would not stay buried again. The footsteps drew nearer. Oscar heard low voices, calm, controlled, absolutely merciless. These were men accustomed to violence. They would not ask twice for what they believed belonged to them. They would kill efficiently and leave nothing behind. He moved silently, positioning himself to the side of the window where he could see their approach without being seen in turn. 2 figures emerged from the darkness, then a third. They moved with tactical precision. They were seasoned hunters, and he was their cornered prey. If he didn't act first, they would. Oscar forced himself to think. Violence could not be his first choice. Amara was here. The widow was here. One shot would bring chaos crashing down, but if he waited too long, any advantage would slip away. A soft, metallic click sounded outside the door. Someone tested the knob. The door's hinges groaned slightly as pressure was applied. Oscar felt adrenaline surge like fire in his veins. He tightened his grip on the gun, then another sound, a window latch trembling. They were checking every entry point. Finally, one of the men raised his voice, polite and cold enough to freeze marrow. "Mr. Bennett, we know you're inside. You've made some regrettable decisions. Hand over the case. Let's not complicate this further." Oscar's gut twisted. They didn't simply want the money, they wanted the threat contained. They wanted silence, a silence guaranteed only through death. His knuckles whitened around the revolver. He needed to stall them, to buy time for the widow and Amara to escape if the worst happened. "You have no right to be here," he called back, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. "Leave now. You won't get what you're looking for." A laugh, quiet and amused. "What we're looking for, Mr. Bennett, is the status quo. The world works best when certain truths remain where they belong, buried." The front door shuddered as a shoulder slammed into it. The widow tightened her hold on Amara, whispering prayers through clenched teeth. Oscar stepped back, gun raised, heart pounding. He knew he couldn't kill all of them alone, but maybe he didn't have to. Maybe he only needed to delay them long enough. One of the windows shattered with a violent crash, glass spraying inward. Oscar fired instinctively toward the sound. The gunshot exploded through the cabin, the recoil jarring his arm. A cry of pain came from outside. One of the men had been hit. Chaos erupted. The other attackers shouted orders. Bullets punched through the wooden walls, sending splinters flying and forcing Oscar to dive for cover. Amara screamed. The widow covered her mouth again, tears streaming down her face. "Please, God, protect us," she whispered over and over. Oscar's mind raced. If the cabin burned or collapsed, or if bullets found their mark, the crawl space might be their only hope. He crawled toward them, keeping low as gunfire tore through the air. The men outside were advancing, seeing fear as an invitation rather than a deterrent. He reached the widow and nudged her toward the crawl space. She hesitated, unwilling to leave him. He couldn't waste time arguing. "Go," he breathed, fierce and urgent. He looked into her eyes, those haunted eyes, and she understood. She pulled Amara with her, slipping into the darkness beneath the floorboards. Another bullet cracked into the wall above Oscar's head. He felt debris patter against his back. The men had reached the door again. He could see the wood splintering, the hinges straining. He slid behind the overturned table that now served as his only shield. His breathing slowed. His mind sharpened. He had to give them a reason to hesitate. "I sent it," Oscar called out loudly, letting his words cut into the air. "Everything. The copies, the names, the photograph. If you kill me, the whole world will know what you've done." There was a beat of silence. Tense, furious. "You're bluffing," one voice snapped. "Try me," Oscar answered, and even he was surprised by the confidence in his tone. The door crashed open. They stormed in, shadows with guns drawn, faces twisted by the threat of exposure. Oscar fired again. A man staggered back, falling through the doorway. Another bullet struck Oscar's shoulder, burning agony through his flesh, driving him to one knee. He gritted his teeth, refusing to collapse. Blood soaked his shirt, but he kept his gaze focused, his heart refusing to surrender. There were 3 of them left. They entered cautiously now, keeping their weapons trained on his position. His vision blurred, but his purpose stayed razor sharp. He fired once more to distract them, then hurled himself toward the back corner of the room. They followed, shifting their aim at the movement. This was his moment. He lunged for the window, throwing himself through it. Glass slashed his arms and face as he crashed into the cold earth outside. Pain flared, brilliant and consuming, but he forced himself upright. He had only seconds. The men would come out shooting. He sprinted around the cabin, clutching his bleeding shoulder, and spotted the truck partially hidden behind a cluster of bushes. He prayed the keys were still in the ignition. His legs nearly buckled, but he reached the door, yanked it open, and pulled himself inside. In the rearview mirror, he saw the shadows of the men racing toward the corner he had vacated. He started the engine. The roar shattered the night stillness, directing every pair of murderous eyes toward him. They fired. Bullets struck the truck's body, sending sparks flying. One window cracked but didn't break. His hand, slick with blood, struggled to shift the gear, but desperation lent him strength. The truck lurched forward, tearing over branches and rock. He felt the wheels lift as they hit uneven ground, but he didn't let up. The cabin receded into the night. There was no triumphant relief in his chest, only a rising dread that the men might still find the widow and Amara beneath the cabin's floor. He skidded to a stop behind the cabin again, hidden from sight, and stumbled out, barely catching himself on the door frame. His vision swam as he made his way back. The gunfire had ceased. That silence terrified him more than bullets. He approached carefully, crouched low, gun raised. The men were gone. The cabin door hung open, swaying slightly in the wind. He held his breath. Then he heard soft sobbing beneath the floor. He rushed to the crawl space and pulled the board aside. The widow and Amara looked up at him, wide-eyed and trembling. Relief surged through him so violently he nearly collapsed. Blood trickled down his face, but he smiled gently and helped them out, whispering that everything would be okay. Though the truth was, he didn't know if that was a lie. They couldn't stay here. Not anymore. The men had fled, but they would return with reinforcements, with even greater wrath. Oscar led them toward the truck, urging them to move quickly but quietly. He kept watch over every dark space between trees, every shift of moonlight. Minutes later, they were back on the road. The cabin disappeared behind them, swallowed by the thick forest. Oscar drove with one hand pressed tightly against his bleeding shoulder, while the widow tended to the wound as best as she could using strips of torn fabric. Amara reached for him, tears streaking down her cheeks, asking if he was okay. He smiled through the pain, assuring her that he was strong enough to protect them both. None of them knew exactly where to go next. They simply needed distance, time, and hope that the evidence now moving through the system would reach the right eyes before the men caught them again. Hours passed. The first lights of dawn cracked open the horizon. Oscar's body ached with exhaustion and injury, but his spirit burned fierce and bright. He felt something new inside him, an awakening. He was not just a man who stumbled into someone else's nightmare anymore. He was a man who had chosen to fight. Weeks later, after hospital visits in secret under aliases, after help arrived from federal agents stirred by the journalist who received his evidence, after the arrests of high-ranking criminals shook the facade of power in their city, Oscar stood on the porch of a modest home far from where the nightmare began. He wore a sling on his arm, but the wound beneath was healing. The widow lived nearby now, finally free from a lifetime of fear. Amara played in the yard, building sandcastles with new friends, her laughter rising towards the clear sky like a prayer answered. Oscar leaned against the railing, watching her. His heart swelled with gratitude and something deeper, a peace he once believed he would never feel again. The horrors hadn't vanished. He still woke at night from echoes of gunshots, but the future no longer seemed like a threat waiting to devour them. It seemed like possibility. He tightened his grip on the railing, the sunlight warming his scarred skin. The truth had nearly cost him his life, but it had given him something more enduring than silence ever could. He had protected his daughter. He had saved a family that wasn't his own. He had stood up to the kind of evil that buried its crimes in the dark and expected them to stay hidden. And he had won. Amara noticed his gaze and waved excitedly from her castle of sand. Oscar smiled, raising his good arm to wave back. His chest lifted with a slow, steady breath. No fear, no dread, just love and resolve. Some battles were not chosen, they were simply answered. He stepped off the porch and walked toward his daughter under a sky wide and full of hope, knowing that whatever shadows might come again, he would face them unafraid. Don't miss what comes next. Hit that subscribe button right now, turn on all notifications, and dive into our next story. It's even more shocking. And hey, if this video stunned you, share it with